A little girl started following a tourist away from Buckingham Palace. The royal guard on duty wasn't supposed to move, but something about the man's bag made every instinct he'd learned in Afghanistan start screaming. He broke formation, stopped them, opened the bag. What was inside triggered a full palace lockdown and changed everything. Before we tell you what happened next, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Let's get into it. The morning hung soft and golden over London. One of those early summer days when the city feels suspended in honey. Buckingham Palace stood silent against the pale sky, its white stone glowing like old bones in sunlight. The scent of warm pavement mixed with distant horses and sweet roasted nuts from a vendor's cart drifted across the forecourt. Crowds lined the ceremonial barriers in waves, parents balancing toddlers on shoulders, American tourists wrestling with paper maps that refused to fold properly. Dozens of phone screens pointed at the iron gates like digital offerings. Children pressed against the ropes, mesmerized by the towering figures in red coats and bearskin hats. An elderly woman clutched a thermos of tea, explaining to her granddaughter about tradition and duty in hushed tones. University students from Germany compare their guidebooks, pointing excitedly at architectural details most people missed. A group of Japanese tourists moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, their guide holding a small flag as she explained the significance of each ceremonial element. Behind them, a family from Manchester struggled with a pushchair while their twin boys darted between adult legs, fascinated by the pigeons that seemed utterly unbothered by the human chaos around them. Someone dropped a paper coffee cup, and it rolled across the stone with a hollow scraping sound until a palace staffer quickly retrieved it. The air buzzed with a dozen different languages. Spanish tourists reading aloud from travel apps, French students taking notes for some sort of assignment, Italian families debating the best photo angles. A street performer in the distance played violin, his case open for coins, the melody drifting over the crowd and mixing with the urban symphony of distant traffic. And helicopter rotors. Everyone waiting for the changing of the guard. Voices buzzing with that electric anticipation you only get when you're about to witness something ancient. The kind of crowd that forms organically around a history, respectful but restless, eager but patient. Most had been standing for at least 20 minutes, some much longer, and the collective energy was building toward that moment when centuries of tradition would unfold before their eyes. Lance Corporal Matthew Rees stood motionless just left of the East Gate, Irish Guards, 2nd Battalion, 36 years old, 10 years of service to tours in Helmand Province, where he'd earned a silver commendation pulling wounded men to cover while Taliban rounds cracked overhead. His left shoulder carried a scar from shrapnel that still ached when London's weather turned damp. Most tourists saw red fabric and burst in a costume, something ornamental. They had no idea what they were looking at. Behind the stillness of his ceremonial stance, Rees' eyes moved like water sweeping, locking, cataloging every detail, from the nervous shuffle of first-time visitors to the wide-eyed wonder of school children. He tracked patterns without appearing to move at all. His peripheral vision caught the vendor's cart with its slightly squeaky wheel, the pigeon that always landed near the fountain at exactly 9:47, the spot where tour groups invariably paused to take group photos. He could tell you which tourists were genuinely excited, and which were just going through the motions. He could spot pickpockets before they made their move. He knew the difference between someone lost and someone deliberately loitering. 18 years of training, first in basic, then in places where attention to detail meant the difference between coming home and being shipped home, had taught him one fundamental truth. Danger doesn't knock, it blends in. It wears holiday clothes and carries cameras and smiles for the pictures. Right up until the moment it doesn't. A horse's hoof struck cobblestone from the barracks. Pigeons scattered as a child dropped popcorn. A woman laughed too loudly and snapped a photo with a disposable camera. Flash blazing. Reed didn't blink. That's when he noticed her. 7 years old, maybe 8. White sundress with tiny flowers that had probably looked crisp that morning, but now showed the wrinkles of a long day exploring the city. Pink sandals that had definitely seen better days. Scuffed at the toes from skipping along pavements, her ponytail was coming loose, strands escaping the elastic in a particular way that screamed absent parent or very long morning. She clutched a tourist map, folded so many times the edges were torn and damp from sweaty palms. But she wasn't with anyone. She stood close and comfortably close to a man in a faded baseball cap and cargo shirt, the kind of outfit that was designed to scream harmless tourist, but felt slightly off. like a costume that didn't quite fit. Large DSLR camera hanging from his neck like a badge of authenticity. Though Ree noticed the lens cap hadn't been removed since the man arrived. Weathered rucksack with a black zipper that didn't quite close properly, and a luggage tag from somewhere Ree couldn't make out from this distance. But the script looked Eastern European. The man wasn't watching the guards, wasn't taking pictures, wasn't doing any of the things tourists do when they're about to witness something they've traveled thousands of miles to see. Instead, he kept checking his watch, not casually glancing for the time, but studying it with purpose, timing something. His eyes swept the forecourt with mechanical precision, lingering on the maintenance gate tucked beside the main entrance. That gate was supposed to be off limits to the public, but service staff had been using it all morning for equipment access. Most telling of all, the man's attention kept drifting toward the service entrance, not the ceremonial gates where the action would happen, not the areas where tourists naturally gravitated, but the quiet, unguarded exit that led away from the crowds and toward the street. The little girl fidgeted beside him in a way that made Ree's chest tighten. Didn't speak, didn't touch his arm or tug his sleeve the way kids do with family members they're comfortable around, just stayed close because she'd clearly been told to every 10 to 15 seconds. Her eyes darted backward through the crowd, like she was looking for someone. Her free hand twisted the hem of her sundress into wrinkles, and her shoulders carried the kind of tension you usually see in adults, not children, who are waiting to be found. Ree's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The man's posture was wrong, shoulders relaxed, but artificially so, like someone performing casualness for an audience. His breathing was too controlled, too measured. Ree had seen that same forced calm in Afghanistan, usually right before someone tried to detonate an IED or opened fire on that checkpoint. It was the breathing of someone managing adrenaline, someone whose heart rate was elevated, but who was working hard not to show it. The camera hanging around his neck told another story entirely. Professional-grade DSLR, expensive lens, but the settings were all wrong. The aperture was closed down for bright outdoor photography, but they were standing in shade. The ISO was set to high for daylight conditions. Either this man didn't know how to use a camera worth several thousand, or he wasn't actually planning to take any pictures with it. More troubling was his positioning. He'd chosen a spot that offered clear sight lines to 3 different exit routes: the main ceremonial gates, the service entrance, and the small pedestrian gate that most tourists didn't even notice. His feet were positioned at a slight angle, weight distributed in a way that would allow for quick movement in any direction. It wasn't the stance of someone settling in to watch a ceremony. It was the stance of someone preparing to move. That bag looked too full. One front pocket hastily resealed with nylon cord that didn't match the rest of the hardware. The bottom showed wear patterns inconsistent with normal tourist use scuff marks that suggested it had been dragged across rough surfaces, not just carried through airports and hotels. Then the man crouched slightly, whispered something near the girl's ear. She didn't respond, just turned toward him slowly. Uncertain but obedient, he started walking, casual pace, toward that side path. The girl hesitated, looked around, looked back, then she started following him. No one noticed. No mother calling out, no frantic voices. Just a child following a stranger while hundreds of people watched. Nothing at all. Except Ree saw everything, saw how her shoulders hunched, how her steps lagged behind his, how she kept glancing sideways instead of forward, not excited, not comfortable, terrified. Lance Corporal Matthew readjusted his grip on his rifle strap, not to raise it, just to feel its weight. His stance remained perfect, eyes forward, but inside every alarm he'd learned to trust in Afghanistan was screaming. The girl had crossed the rope line now, moving with that awkward, too small pace kids have when they're trying to keep up with adult legs. The man in the baseball cap didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't show any of the patience you'd expect from someone genuinely caring for a child, just kept strolling toward the unguarded side gate like he knew exactly where he was going, and exactly how long it would take to get there. Removed. One step, deliberate, controlled. The effect was immediate and electric. The crowd gasped like they'd been collectively slapped. A woman in a Union Jack t-shirt raised her phone with an audible click, her mouth falling open. A child with ice cream pointed with sticky fingers, tugging frantically at his father's sleeve. He moved. They're not supposed to move. Is this part of the show, Dad? Why did the soldier leave his spot? The whispers rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Tourists began nudging each other, pointing, some stepping closer to the barriers. while others instinctively backed away. Someone started filming with professional-looking equipment. A teenager in school uniform whispered, "This isn't normal. Guards never break formation." Ree stepped completely out of formation, boots hitting stone with that particular military cadence that somehow manages to sound both controlled and urgent. Not running that would have caused panic, not rushing that would have looked unprofessional, just walking with the kind of authority that makes people step aside without being asked, creates space where there wasn't space before. The crowd began parting instinctively, some following his path with their eyes, others twisting to see what he was heading toward. The energy in the square shifted from casual tourism to something electric and uncertain. Parents pulled children closer without quite knowing why. A teenage girl stopped mid-selfie, lowering her phone as she sensed the change in atmosphere. "Something's happening," someone whispered behind him. "That's not normal," an older man said to his wife, pulling out reading glasses to get a better look. "Guards don't just leave their posts." A woman with a Yorkshire accent spoke louder. "Should we be worried? Is this some kind of security thing?" The questions rippled through the crowd like wildfire. People began looking around nervously, some stepping back from the barriers, others pressing forward to get a better view. A few started recording everything with their phones, sensing they might be witnessing something significant. The collective mood shifted from anticipation to anxiety, as hundreds of people suddenly realized they had no idea what was happening, or whether they should be concerned for their safety. "Young miss," he called out, voice calm but carrying clearly, "can you stop there a moment?" The girl froze mid-step, startled. She looked up, then instinctively toward the man. The man finally turned slow pivot, looking inconvenienced rather than surprised. "She's with me," he said smoothly. "Everything's fine." Ree kept walking, boots tapping crisp rhythm on stone. "Are you her father, uncle?" Quick smile. Practice. Ree stopped a meter away, positioning himself between them without making it obvious. "What's her name?" The man shifted his bag. "Sophie. She's a bit overwhelmed by the crowd. I told her we'd take the quiet path and meet the others by the ice cream cart." Ree knelt just enough to meet the girl's eyes. "Is your name Sophie?" She stared at him, didn't nod, didn't shake her head, just stood there with her hands balled into fists. "Look, mate." The man's voice carried a hint of annoyance now. "She's shy with strangers. We're just trying to get out of the way here." Ree rose slowly. "Sir, I need you both to stay right here. You people and your power trips." The man sighed exaggeratedly. "What are you going to do? Arrest me for walking with my niece?" "No one's being arrested. We're just making sure everything's in order." The girl said nothing, but her eyes locked on Ree like he was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid around them. The crowd had gone unusually quiet. Phones still hovered, whispers spread, but something had shifted. People didn't know what they were watching, but they knew it wasn't ceremony anymore. Ree pressed his radio. "Control, this is guard for at East for court requesting child welfare check. Possible separation. Male adult with gray satchel and blue cap near side gate B needs secondary eyes. Copy, guard for units en route." The man raised an eyebrow. "Seriously, you're escalating this over nothing?" But Ree was looking at the bag now, really looking. The outer flap was buckled tight, but uneven, like it had been repacked in a hurry. Fabric bulged at odd angles on the bottom corner. Faint residue powdered rust brown rubbed into the stitching, like it had traveled through dust. Not the bag of someone on holiday with a child. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Ree asked the girl gently. She bit her lip. Then, barely audible, "Alice." The man's expression tightened. "She's lying. Kids do this when they're nervous. I told you her name's Sophie, sir." Ree's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet. "I'm going to ask you not to speak to her right now." Two palace security officers jogged across the courtyard, radios crackling. The man noticed them coming, and his hand drifted toward his backstrap. "You've given me two different names," Ree said calmly. "She appears distressed, and that bag doesn't look like it belongs to someone here for tourism." The man tried to laugh. "You people really take yourselves seriously." Ree didn't answer, but his left foot shifted slightly, barely visible positioning that someone with training might recognize. "Not aggressive, just ready. Guard for confirmed child status." Came the radio. "Female, approximately 7 years old, name given as Alice, male claims guardianship, but child appears non-responsive to familial cues." Alice had moved closer now, close enough that her arm brushed Ree's red tunic. She was breathing fast, shallow, tight breaths that spoke of barely controlled fear. The man noticed. His jaw clenched. "What exactly do you think this is?" His voice dropped low. "Some kind of kidnapping?" You're going to feel real stupid. When her parents show up, we'll sort that out, Ree replied evenly. But inside, pieces were clicking together. The inconsistent story, the strange bag, the child's body language, her fear. It wasn't enough for rest, not yet, but it was enough to act. Security arrived and rebriefed them quickly while keeping his eyes on the man. Alice stayed pressed against his side, one small hand gripping the wool of his tunic. Sir, the lead officer approached the man professionally. We need to ask you a few questions. The man's weight shifted, shoulders squaring, elbow twitching toward his bag. Ree recognized the signs. Pre-flight behavior, the tiny unconscious movements people make before running or lying. Put the bag down, Ree said quietly. I'm not doing anything illegal. You have no right. Then you won't mind cooperating until we sort this out. The man jerked backward as Ree reached for the strap, not an attack, but sharp enough to be telling. Too quick to be innocent. The bag slipped from his shoulder, caught on Ree's gloved fingers for a moment, then dropped to the stone with a hollow thud that somehow sounded heavier than it should have. Ree crouched and unbuckled the main flap. Everything changed. Beneath a hastily folded black windbreaker, 2 silver aerosol canisters, completely unlabeled, their surfaces scratched like they'd been modified. Laminated street maps with color-coded routes drawn in precise ink, not tourist scribbles, but careful planning. Red lines, blue circles, timing notations in the margins, a clipboard with times and symbols written in clean military handwriting that spoke of preparation and purposed a small foreign brand walkie-talkie, its antenna deliberately removed for concealment, battery light, still blinking green. But it was what else Ree saw that made his blood go cold. A printed security schedule, not the public ceremony times but internal staff rotations, guard positions, shift changes, break times. Information that wasn't available to tourists. Information that had to be obtained through insider access or extensive surveillance. A folded plastic bag containing what looked like powdered chalk, but smelled faintly chemical when the breeze caught it. Cable ties in 3 different sizes, still in their original packaging but with the barcodes carefully removed. And tucked behind everything else, a second child's jacket, navy blue, size small, with a name tag reading Emma in a child's careful handwriting. Beneath that, a laminated card with photos, headshots of what appeared to be other children, each with handwritten notes about height, hair color, and clothing descriptions, times and locations scribbled in the margins. 10:47, red shoes, blonde hair, blue dress. 11:23, brown hair, green jacket with grandmother. 12:15, twins, matching yellow shirts, parents distracted by phones. This wasn't surveillance, this was hunting. The implications hit Ree like a physical blow. This man hadn't randomly chosen Alice. He'd been watching, cataloging, planning. The jacket with Emma's name suggested he'd already succeeded at least once before or was planning to succeed again soon. This wasn't about one little girl. This was a system. Ree keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Control. Guard for initiating code white at gate 3. Multiple suspicious materials confirmed. Possible coordinated threat. Request immediate full lockdown. The response crackled back instantly. Confirmed. Guard 4. Initiating lockdown protocol. All units responding. Somewhere in the palace, steel gates began closing. The changing of the guard procession halted mid-formation. Mounted officers paused. The distant two-tone warble of security alerts echoed off stone walls. Ree stood between Alice and the man, planted like bedrock. The man had gone completely still. No more deflection, no more smiles, just cold calculation, eyes scanning for escape. Roots. Security moved in with professional efficiency. No drama, no shouting, just cuffs and controlled positioning. The man didn't resist, which somehow made it worse because innocent people usually do. More officers arrived as the bag's contents were photographed and secured. Maps with timing patterns, spray devices with pressure valves, a list of tourist locations with June dates marked, not just Buckingham Palace, 5 other sites. This wasn't about one little girl. It was a pattern. Requesting EOD and counterterrorism liaison. One officer spoke into his radio. You need to see this layout. Alice stood behind Ree, still gripping his tunic. She hadn't cried, hadn't made a sound, just held on, like he was the only thing keeping her from floating away. The crowd was being moved back, not gently, but firmly. Some resisted, phones still up, but the mood had shifted completely. No one thought this was theater anymore. Ree didn't move from his position, boots planted, body at rest but ready. He wasn't. the focus now. He didn't try to be. His job was simply to stand between a frightened child and everything else, until someone better qualified could take over. The man Victor Lasky, they learned later, said nothing during processing, no demands. For lawyers, no protestations of innocence, just silence and that cold stare. Alice's parents arrived 45 minutes later. The mother collapsed to her knees the moment she saw her daughter, sobbing so hard the attending officer stepped forward to steady her. The father followed with arms outstretched, voice cracking as he said her name over and over. "We lost her in the fountain queue," the mother explained through tears. "I turned away for 1 second to fix my bag. Just 1 second." Alice pointed toward Ree. "That's the man who helped me." The investigation revealed the true scope within hours. Victor Lasky, Slovakian national, age 41. No legitimate family connection to Alice or any other child. He'd simply spotted her alone in the fountain queue, waited for the right moment, and told her there was an emergency with her parents that he'd been sent by palace security to bring her to safety. She believed him, just long enough to follow. The aerosol canisters were industrial-grade dispersal devices, designed for agricultural use, but easily modified for crowd deployment. Harmless on their own, but the chalk-like powder tested positive for irritants that would cause mass panic in enclosed spaces. The maps showed coordinated timing with ceremony schedules, tourist flow patterns, and emergency evacuation routes. Each location was marked with specific entry points and optimal dispersal zones. But the most chilling discovery was the notebook found in his hotel room during the follow-up search. Page after page of surveillance notes, guard rotation times, crowd density calculations, photos of unattended children at 5 different London tourist sites over the past 2 weeks. Names, ages, what they were wearing, who they were with. He had been planning this for months. The lead investigator explained quietly to Ree during the debrief. Not just here. Tower Bridge, Westminster Abbey, the London Eye. Alice was going to be the distraction while he deployed the irritants, create mass panic, overwhelm security response, collect intelligence on emergency protocols. We found evidence of at least 3 other potential targets. The missing walkie-talkie was never recovered, suggesting a partner who had escaped. MI5 swept the surrounding areas, checked transport hubs, reviewed hours of CCTV footage. 2 days later, a man matching the description from Lasky's notebook was detained at Heathrow, attempting to board a flight to Prague. He had detailed floor plans of government buildings and a list of high-profile public events scheduled for the summer. "You didn't just stop a kidnapping," the investigator continued. "You disrupted an entire intelligence-gathering operation. But it hadn't happened because someone noticed, not an analyst in an office, not a supervisor reading reports, just a soldier, standing exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he'd been trained to do even when it meant breaking the rules. They didn't give him a medal, no press conference, no official recognition. By afternoon, the forecourt had returned to its normal rhythm. New guards took position. Tourists lined up again. The changing of the guard proceeded on schedule reduced, but restored. As Alice's family prepared to leave, her mother approached Ree one final time. Mascara streaked her cheeks in dark lines, hands trembling as she reached toward him, but stopped just short of actually touching his uniform, uncertain of protocol even in her emotional state. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking on the words, "I keep thinking about what could have happened. What would have happened if you hadn't." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her husband stood behind her, one hand on Alice's shoulder, the other wiping his own eyes. "We were told you broke formation, that guards aren't supposed to move from their posts." Ree nodded once. "That's correct, but you did anyway." "Yes, sir." The man's voice grew thick. "Why?" Ree looked down at Alice, who was watching the exchange with those serious eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Because she needed someone to see her." Alice stepped forward on her own initiative. She looked up at him not as a soldier, or a guard, or someone from a storybook, but as the man who had been there when the world stopped making sense, who had stood between her and something she couldn't name, but had felt in her bones. She didn't hug him. Palace protocol probably wouldn't have allowed it, and she seemed to sense that. Didn't say thank you in words because 7-year-olds often know that some things are bigger than words. Instead, she simply stood on her toes and pressed her palm gently against the front of his red tunic, right over his heart, holding it there for a long moment, like she was making sure he was real, making sure he would remember her just as she would remember him. Then she looked up at his face and gave him the smallest, most serious nod, a gesture that seemed to contain understanding, far beyond her years. Then she walked away with her parents, her small hand firmly clasped in her mother's. Finally safe, Ree returned to his post later that afternoon, not because he had to, but because it was his duty. His boots found their precise position near the ceremonial gate. His rifle strap was reset, his shoulders squared beneath the weight of tradition. To most tourists, it looked like nothing had happened, but a few recognized him. A girl pointed and whispered to her father. A man near the barrier lowered his phone, choosing simply to watch. Instead, for those who knew what nearly had been, that ceremonial silence carried a different weight, because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on distant fields. Sometimes they happen on busy London streets, when one person chooses to trust their instincts instead of following protocol. Sometimes saving lives is as simple as noticing when something doesn't belong and refusing to look away. And sometimes, the difference between a child going home safely and vanishing into something unthinkable comes down to a soldier who remembered that protecting people matters more than protecting appearances. Would you have noticed something wrong about that man in the crowd? Should ceremonial guards be allowed to break protocol when lives are at stake? What would you have done if you were standing nearby when this happened? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story gave you new respect for the instincts behind the uniform, hit that like button and show these dedicated soldiers the recognition they deserve. Subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories, real events that prove these men and women are anything but ceremonial. And if someone you know still thinks these guards are just statues in fancy dress, send them this video. Let them see what duty really looks like when it matters most. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen right now. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.